The year is 445 BCE. The Roman Republic had just experienced one of the most important events in its entire history with the establishment of the 12 Tables. The tables would serve as the backing of Rome's entire law code for centuries to come, and yet they were not perfect. Far from it. The tables still favored the Patricians, and quite understandably, the Plebeians were not quite happy with this fact. One particular law in the 12 Tables was of special discontent from the Plebeians. In the 11th table, the decemvir had managed to outlaw intermarriage between patricians and plebeians. As you can imagine, most patricians had no real problem with this. After all, this was just another way for them to maintain their superior status in Rome's society. And truthfully, most plebeians probably didn't care all that much either. So then what was the issue? Well, I said most plebeians. The issue came in the form of wealthy and influential plebeians. These plebeians saw the potential in getting to marry their sons or daughters to patricians. While they themselves would not be made patricians, the children of such a marriage would be. I'm sure you can see the advantage here. This all brings us back to 445 BCE and the story of the Third Secession of the Plebeians. Before we get any further into today's episode, I just want to quickly ask that you subscribe and like if you enjoy my content. It really helps the channel out and it motivates me to make more content. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. Our story starts with a man named Gaius Canuleius. Gaius was a tribune of the Plebs in 445 BCE. His gens, the Canuleia gens, was a relatively minor plebeian family. We know they were wealthy, but other than a few tribune of the Plebs, some senators in later Roman history, and a couple of legates, the family was never one of the major plebeian families. Gaius, however, must have been fairly influential. Not only was he elected as tribune of the Plebs, but we know that the majority of the other plebeian tribunes followed his lead on most matters. It would seem that Gaius certainly believed this, as at some point in 445 BCE, we aren't quite sure when, Gaius felt comfortable enough to propose something that had the potential to not only ruin his political career, but could have just as easily ended his life. If you've seen the video on the 12 tables, if not the link will be in the upper right hand corner, then you would know that the decemvir had managed to make marriage between plebeians and patricians illegal in the 11th table. This did not sit right with Gaius, and so he proposed that Rogatio be put forward to repeal the law. I hear you asking, what is a Rogatio? Well, maybe you're not asking, but I'm going to act like you are anyway. Well, Rogatio is one of the most interesting aspects of Roman legislative history. A Rogatio was any legislative proposal, i.e. a bill, put before an assembly of the people of Rome. Now, why is that so interesting, you may ask? Well, this was an ultimate reminder to the Senate that they technically had no legislative power. Yes, they could issue decrees, and the day-to-day running of the state fell to them and the consuls, but they were still unable to pass actual laws without the approval of the People's Assembly. So what was the process surrounding the Rogatio? Well, I'm glad you asked. Any magistrate with the power to summon the People's Assembly. At this time, the consuls and the tribune of the Plebs certainly had the power, and it's a little unclear if senators and other magistrates had the same level of power, or if they needed the backing of the consuls or tribunes, could propose a Rogatio. After the proposal of a Rogatio, the Senate would come together to craft the bill into formal language. The laws themselves would be called the leges rogati. The bill's sponsor was the lator, and any supporters were known as the auctors. After the Senate had drafted the bill, it would be promulgated for at least 3 weeks, but typically more. This normally consisted of putting the text of said bill up for display in marketplaces, the forum, and other such important places. At the same time, the call for the assembly to assemble would go out. During this period, the citizens of Rome were free to discuss the bill amongst themselves and propose changes, either in private or at informal sessions which were sometimes attended by the lator or an auctor. Once the bill made it before the full assembly, it could no longer be amended. At the assembly itself, the lator would ask, "Velitis abetis quaeritis." I apologize for my terrible Latin pronunciation, but in English it would translate to something like, "Citizens, are you going to approve the order?" The assembly would then respond yea or nay without discussion. Typically, if a bill made it this far, it would be accepted. Normally, a bill would be pulled rather than suffer a defeat. After this, the bill would become law, lex in Latin, upon the formal announcement of the assembly's decision by the presiding magistrate, and be inscribed into copper or marble tablets and kept in the Roman treasury. That was a bit of a detour, but I think it's an interesting piece of Roman history. Now back to Gaius. Well, Gaius had put forward his Rogatio, and the Senate, and especially the consuls, were not happy. Marcus Genicus Argensis and Gaius Curtius Philo, the two consuls, called this an attempt to break Rome's moral and social fabric at a time when the city faced several external threats. There was seemingly a revolt in Ardea, the people of Veii were raiding again, and the Aqui and the Volsci seemed to be building up for some sort of invasion. This seemingly worked to sway some of the Roman citizenry towards the consuls, as Gaius was forced to give a speech to the people of Rome, where he reminded the people that some of Rome's greatest men had been of low birth, including some Roman kings, and he called out the consuls and the Senate for their hypocrisy on the issue of Rome's social and moral fabric, by pointing out that they had given Roman citizenship to many of Rome's defeated enemies. Surely that was more detrimental to Rome's moral fabric than the intermarriage of Rome's classes, right? Well, it seems that the people agreed and backed Gaius. Now, we cannot know this for sure, but in my humble opinion, this support energized Gaius, and he saw an opportunity to push for more. So in addition to his bill supporting marriage between plebeians and patricians, Gaius also introduced a bill calling for the consulship to be open to plebeians. Now, that would have been a game changer, and likely would have resulted in a dramatic shift in power dynamics in Rome. As you can imagine, this further inflamed the tensions between the two classes, but the plebeians were still not at the point of secession just yet. This all changed when one of the consuls, we're pretty sure it was Gaius Curtius, made some sort of comment to the effect of insinuating that the gods themselves would be displeased if the two classes mixed together. This infuriated the plebeians to a point that they went on a military strike and refused to defend the city from any threats. As you can imagine, this terrified the Senate and the Patricians, and they quickly admitted defeat on the issue of intermarriage, allowing the Rogatio to come to a vote. The vote resulted in the annulling of the law in the 12 tables, and patricians and plebeians were now allowed to intermarry. However, there was still one issue to deal with, and that was plebeian access to the consulship. This was a whole other conversation. With the intermarriage issue, at least those who didn't support such a thing could conceivably disallow such a practice in their own family. With the issue of the consulship, there would be absolutely no way to prevent plebeians from winning at least one, and probably both, of the consulships. Remember that consuls were elected among the general citizenry. Because of this, there was absolutely no way that this issue would be allowed to go to a vote. Senator Gaius Claudius Sabinus Regilensis, a brother and uncle to two members of the decemvirs, went so far as to suggest that the consuls in the Senate should use military force to compel the tribunes and striking plebeians to give the issue up. Where they were going to get these troops is a bit of a mystery to me, as I'm pretty sure most of their manpower was currently striking and refusing to even come close to the military, but I digress. This dramatic escalation was prevented by two senators, Lucius Quinticus Cincinnatus and his brother, Titus Quinticus Capitolinus Barbetus. Does that first name sound familiar? It should, as that is the Cincinnatus. You know, the one who served as dictator twice, but gave the power up and became a legend because of it. I made a video on the guy if you don't, and I would really recommend checking it out. He might be the coolest Roman ever. We are told that these two men stepped into the debate, where I can imagine they told Gaius Claudius to shut his mouth, and reminded him of the situation they faced. We should remember that both Cincinnatus and his brother were staunchly anti-plebeian. After this, admittedly personally presumed beatdown, Gaius Claudius then suggested that instead of allowing the plebeians to have access to the consulship, the plebeians be given permission to serve as consular tribunes instead. We are told these consular tribunes were typically elected to serve in lieu of consuls. The Senate would be presented with a decree at the start of every election cycle, where they would determine if consuls or consular tribunes would be elected. We are told that some 70% of the time between 444 and 367 BCE, the Senate chose consular tribunes. Now, this position and its authenticity is called into serious question when we zoom out and look at the whole picture. Virtually, nearly every single elected consular tribune was a patrician. When we combine this with the fact that Rome was in the process of some serious expansion into central Italy, and that the Roman army and government had started to need more than just two people to be in charge of it, a different picture begins to emerge. Most modern historians, myself included, view this account of Livy to be false. Instead, it would seem that the position of consular tribune developed in response to the need for commanders and magistrates further from the city of Rome. Two consuls simply was not cutting it anymore. More people with command were needed if Rome was going to continue to expand effectively. Whatever the case, Livy tells us that this was well received among the plebeians, and the proposal was agreed to, with consular tribunes elected the following year. And thus, the secession, if you can really call it that, was over. This one was more like a general strike rather than a real secession. After all, we didn't even get to go to everyone's favorite mountain, the Mons Sacer. But it was also just as successful as the first two, in that what the plebeians wanted, they got. In this secession, the plebeians had the right to intermarry returned to them, and if Livy is to be believed, access to one of the most powerful positions in Rome. The Lex Canuleius, as the law would come to be known, would be celebrated for centuries to come, not only for its content, but also for what it represented. It again showed that the plebeians could move mountains when they came together, and this law and what it represented would go on to inspire plebeians pushing for change for centuries to come. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. This is my first video back after having a pretty damn bad cold. I lost my voice for about 3 days, and it was only really this morning, this was recorded on Sunday, June 11th, that I was able to talk normally. Hopefully my still sick voice wasn't too distracting or horrible to listen to. The next few videos might be a bit on the shorter side as I get back into the swing of things and my voice fully recovers. But I'm so happy to be back, and I hope you guys are happy to hear from me again. If you have any comments or questions on the video or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel out. Peace.